Okay, class, we're going to begin our lecture for the evening. So, if I can have your attention, please. So we're going to continue on and talk about the endocrine system. Okay, so we just completed talking about the nervous system. Okay, we talked about the spine. We talked about the spinal cord. We talked about the spinal nerves. We talked about all those structures, as well as some of those special senses. So we're going to move on at this time and cover the endocrine system. Okay, so the first thing that you might notice here, up at the top, I'm calling it the neuroendocrine system. And the reason why we sometimes, we don't just call it the endocrine system, we sometimes refer to as the neuroendocrine system. It's because the endocrine system is going to work very closely with the nervous system, and it has a lot of similarities as well with the nervous system. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we call it the neuroendocrine system, and that's going to be especially true when we talk about a particular area that you need to be very familiar with, which is going to be between the basically the pituitary gland is going to be something very, very important that I'll let you know when we get there. But the neuroendocrine system is very, very true when we talk about that, especially. Okay, so again, the neuroendocrine system is one of several cell-to-cell communication systems within the body. The nervous system being the other one that we talked about. Now, the endocrine system is going to be similar to the nervous system. There are some similarities, and then there's going to be some differences as well. And the reason why this is important to mention, the reason why it's important to say that there are similarities and that there are differences, is because you're usually asked those types of questions on exams. Okay, to compare and contrast the similarities and the differences between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So there are some similarities or some differences. So as I mentioned, similar to the nervous system, the endocrine system is also going to be suited for some type of communication. Okay, so both systems play a role in communication. Now, the nervous system is going to utilize rapid and generally short-lived responses to a particular stimuli. So the example that we were speaking about in another lecture, we said that if you put your hand on a hot plate or something, your hand starts burning, you're going to send out those electrical signals. Okay, those are electrical messengers, electrical signals, and that's going to cause you to react and move your hand away. Okay, so again, it's going to, the nervous system utilizes rapid and generally short-lived responses to a particular stimuli. Now, the endocrine system is a little bit different. Okay, the endocrine system, okay, down here, the endocrine system, what it does is that it's going to function and basically its responses to stimuli are going to function over hours, over days, or even weeks. And the endocrine system, like I mentioned, some of those responses can be very, very quick, and some of those responses can be very slow. Okay, so we generally say that the nervous system, quick electrical signals, and the endocrine system, we say it's a lot slower. And the endocrine system is going to be using chemicals. It's going to be using hormones. Okay, that's the name of the chemicals that the endocrine system is going to be using. It's going to use these special chemicals that we call hormones. And again, I want to remind everybody that the nervous system and the endocrine system are going to function virtually seamlessly together. And that's the reason why we often call it the neuroendocrine system. Okay, so again, both are going to use chemicals that bind to specific receptors on their target sites, both the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, now they're going to share actually many of the same chemical messengers. So when we were talking about the nervous system and we were talking about acetylcholine and we were talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine and all of those different types of neurotransmitters, some of those chemical messengers are also shared in the endocrine system. Now, when we're talking about those chemicals in the nervous system, they're typically called neurotransmitters. And when we're talking about those chemicals and their effects in the endocrine system, we call them hormones. Okay. Again, the nervous system typically is going to communicate directly onto the tissues using electrical stimulation, while the endocrine system is going to use your blood and your circulation to send those chemicals to target tissues. So another important thing to understand here is that both are regulated primarily by negative feedback mechanisms. So an example that, if you had your lab today already, an example that we can talk about as far as that's concerned is insulin. Okay, the lab that we did today, or the lab that you're going to do this week, is in regards to insulin. So insulin is going to be one of those hormones that's produced, and it's regulated primarily by a negative feedback mechanism. There are some hormones that function via positive feedback mechanisms or positive feedback systems. But again, most homeostatic systems in the body are negative feedback, including a lot of these hormones. There are some exceptions though, and you should know some of these as well. So the example that I'm going to give right now, like I said, is insulin. That's the lab that we're doing this week. And we know that the way that that works is that when blood sugars go up in your body, insulin is going to be released, and insulin is going to cause essentially your blood sugar levels to go back down to the norm. Okay, and if you recall, that's the definition of a negative feedback. It's you're returning back to the direction of normal, okay, against that stimulus that you receive. Okay, that's negative feedback. Okay, another negative feedback mechanism in regards to hormones. In fact, you might not realize it, but you should all know this one already. Okay, and that's blood calcium levels. Does anybody remember how blood calcium levels are correlated with hormones in the endocrine system and how that is a negative feedback mechanism? We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. But if you recall, there are some hormones. There's a particular hormone that's released by the parathyroid glands. And that particular hormone, called PTH, parathyroid hormone, is going to travel to a location where we have lots of storage of calcium. Do you all remember where that is? In your bones. In your bones. Okay, so if we get low blood calcium levels, okay, or if we get high blood calcium levels, okay, certain hormones can be released in order to bring us back to the norm. And you should know that one with bones, and I'll talk about that one a little bit later. And I want you to think of that as we go through this lecture. Okay, so the hormones that relate to bones, and that's what we viewed last semester. Okay, and I'll give you a hint if you're kind of like, okay, I'm kind of thinking of it, but I don't remember it. Osteoclasts. What activates osteoclasts? Osteoblasts. What activates osteoblasts? Okay, and those are the types of questions that you're going to get on your exam. Okay, you're going to get questions regarding hormones and what they activate and how they bring us back into homeostasis. So even though I said that most of them are regulated by negative feedback, that doesn't mean all of them are regulated by negative feedback. There are some hormones that are regulated by positive feedback mechanisms. And you should know one of those that we used, again, as an example throughout the whole course up to this point. We keep going back to the one that's a positive feedback. Do you all remember from first semester? Childbirth. Okay, so that's a perfect example. Childbirth. Okay, labor. So as we mentioned last semester, and we've been mentioning it a little bit. I don't know if we mentioned it this semester yet, but last semester we talked about it. We said childbirth. Who remembers the hormone with childbirth? Oxytocin. Okay, and we said that essentially, if we get a fetus growing in the uterus, growing, eventually it's going to get to the size where it starts to press, the fetus starts to press against the walls of the uterus. It starts to cause stretching. Okay, that's a reflex somewhat. Okay, somewhat of a reflex is involved. Okay, and that stretching is going to essentially cause oxytocin to be released. Okay, oxytocin is produced in another part of the body. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And that oxytocin, when it reaches the uterus, is going to cause the uterus to contract even more. It's not going to cause it to relax. That would be negative feedback. Okay, we're talking about positive feedback. It's going to cause it to contract even more. Okay, so now you're getting a contracted uterus against like an already large fetus. Okay, and that's causing even more contractions, even more stretch on the uterine wall, which then causes more of that hormone to be released. Oxytocin is the hormone, until the baby comes out, until the baby's pushed out. And at that point, once the baby's pushed out, there's no more pressure, there's no more stretch on the uterine wall, and therefore the positive feedback mechanism ends and oxytocin stops being secreted. Okay, so those examples we've been talking about through the semesters, you should feel kind of comfortable with those by now. Okay, so the common goal, again, of both the nervous system and the endocrine system is to preserve homeostasis by coordinating and regulating other cells, tissues, organs, and systems. And then we talked about this. The nervous system is going to conduct signals over long distances using electricity through action potentials, APs. And then the endocrine system is going to release hormones into the circulatory system. And then the thing is this, a lot of books are going to say the endocrine system is going to release hormones that are then going to reach long distance target tissues. That's not always the case. Okay, that's not always the case. Sometimes the target tissues can be nearby. Okay? All right. So we're talking about these hormones, right? We're saying that the endocrine system is going to function utilizing these chemical messengers called hormones. So let's look a little bit closer into what these hormones are. So these hormones are going to be released by particular glands of the endocrine system. These are chemicals that are secreted by these specific endocrine cells, these specific glands. And these hormones, like I mentioned, are going to be secreted directly into the blood. And then the blood is going to transport these hormones, these chemicals, using your blood vessels. Now, the cell targets for these hormones are very often far away, but I said that's not always the case. Sometimes there are some cases where the target tissues or the target cells are close by. These hormones are able to function with very, very low concentrations. You don't need too much of these chemicals to get a response. And these hormones are going to be binding to specific proteins that we find on the outside of our cell membranes called receptors, if you recall. And these receptors are going to have a particular shape, which will only react to particularly shaped hormones. So we usually call this the key and lock mechanism, where a hormone needs to have a particular shape that fits the proper lock, okay, to a cell. Okay, and eventually these hormones that are released, they need to be metabolized. They need to be degraded or eliminated to stop their actions. Many times when we talk about hormones or any chemical being degraded or eliminated in order to stop their actions, we use a term called half-life. And what half-life means, it refers to the amount of time it takes for a chemical to be reduced within the body or to be metabolized or excreted within the body by 50%. So if, for example, you were to have taken 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol, okay, if you were to take 1,000 milligrams of acetaminophen, if the half-life for that is 6 hours, you would expect that within 6 hours, you would only have 500 milligrams of active Tylenol in your body. Okay, and then after another 6 hours, you'd only have 250 milligrams, and so on and so forth until you virtually eliminate that chemical from your body. It would never technically be 100% eliminated. You would always have a tiny, tiny fraction, but for the most part, it would be negligible. So again, the important thing to keep in mind when we talk about these hormones is that these hormones need to be secreted directly into the blood. That's what makes these hormones. And they're secreted directly into the blood via specialized endocrine cells, and these hormones are transported via the circulatory system. Now, why do we need to clarify that? Because if you recall, last semester we also talked about another similar type of tissue called exocrine glands. Okay, we talked about exocrine glands last semester. Do you all remember some examples of exocrine glands that we talked about last semester? Sweat glands, sebaceous glands. Okay, those are good examples of saliva would be another one. Okay, tears would be another one. Okay, so the main definition here for the exocrine glands is that the exocrine glands are going to also produce a chemical, but this chemical is released into ducts, into these small canals. And then those canals will lead to the outside of the body. So like sweat, right? Like oil. It's produced by glands, and then it goes through these ducts, and then it's secreted to the outside of the body. Now, when we talk about digestive juices that are produced by certain glands, because the digestive system is coming up, some of those are also considered exocrine. Even though they're secreting their chemicals into your intestines, remember that the intestines are considered technically the outside of your body, okay? Because it runs like the outside world from the mouth to the anus, essentially, okay? So we also said that hormones are secreted by endocrine glands or endocrine cells, not exocrine, okay? And endocrine glands, we said, will not have ducts, and they are not secreted outside the body. They're secreted into the circulatory system, directly into the circulatory system, okay? And like we said, the cellular targets for these hormones are often far away. It's not always the case. They're not always far away. A couple of examples, this is going a little bit advanced, but a couple of examples is for a term called autocrine versus paracrine. Okay, maybe you've read that in the book, in the chapter in the book. So autocrine, auto meaning self, there are going to be certain glands or certain cells that produce hormones, and then those very, very hormones go to the very, very same cell and activate it. Okay, and an example that I can give you is something called interleukin. Okay, when we're talking about the immune system, interleukin 7, interleukin 3, those are examples of autocrine hormones. Okay, which then would cause the very, very same cell that produced them to start maturing. It's like a self-signal to start maturing. And then the other type of hormone are the paracrine. Those are the ones that are going to affect neighboring cells. Okay, so most of them are going to be paracrine. Okay, question?
Histamine.
Histamine would also be an autocrine. Yeah. Histamine would be an example of that. Yeah. Okay.
What was that second? Autocrine
and paracrine.
paracrine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so another important thing, don't forget, they function by binding to specific cellular receptors. Very important, and they need to be degraded in order for them to terminate their physiological action. The organ that typically does that degrades these hormones is the kidney or the liver. Okay. All right. The next thing that we'll talk about is how we're going to classify hormones. Now, there's an easy way to classify. Remember that proteins and amino acids are virtually the same thing. We said that a protein is a bunch of amino acids linked together, okay? So amino acids and protein hormones, very, very similar. That's one class. Okay, and then a subcategory of that, if you wanted to subdivide them, it would be amino acid derivative hormones and protein hormones. Okay, that would be a way to further divide it. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail in a bit. Okay, and then the other class of hormones would be the steroid hormones, which would be the lipid derivatives. Okay, so let's talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. Let's start with the amino acid derivatives. Okay, so the amino acid derivative hormones, like the name is describing, these are going to be made up of small molecules that are comprised of either one or maybe sometimes two modified amino acids. Okay, and I can give you some examples of some amino acid derivative hormones. For example, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then also the thyroid hormones, okay, T3 and T4. Those are going to be amino acid derivatives. T3 and T4, the amino acid that makes T3 and T4 is an amino acid called tyrosine. Okay, so that's what makes the amino acid derivatives. Okay, another type of amino acid derivative hormone beside the thyroid type, like I mentioned, are the catecholamines. And then the catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Again, the catecholamines are a type of amino acid derivative. I'm showing you some specific subtypes or specific names of some of these catecholamines. And then you have the thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, which we'll talk about later. Okay, and both of these are considered amino acid derivatives. Okay. Okay, we have the peptide hormones. This is another type of hormone. Okay, the peptide hormone, those were those protein hormones I was mentioning just now. Now, most hormones that you're going to learn about are peptide hormones. Okay, and basically what that means is that these are going to be comprised of long chains of amino acids. And these are going to act by binding to receptor molecules on the surface of target cells. And then this binding causes some type of response to occur within the cell. Okay, now some examples of protein hormones include insulin and growth hormone along with gastrin. Okay, again, most hormones of the body are going to be these peptide hormones. Now, some of these peptide hormones are actually considered prohormones or prehormones. Okay, what that basically means is that this prohormone is not going to exert any effect on a target tissue. It needs to be further processed. It needs to be further converted into the active form in order for it to exert its effect. Okay, it's the inactive precursor molecule that needs to be converted into the active form. Okay, now some of these peptide hormones might be short polypeptide chains, some might be longer, and then the examples that we gave here, TSH, LH, FSH, and we'll talk about these specific hormones in more detail a little bit later. Here's insulin. Insulin is a long polypeptide chain, and all of these little circles would represent different amino acids. Okay, now the other classification of hormones are these steroid hormones. Now these steroid hormones are sometimes called lipid derivatives versus the amino acid derivatives that we just mentioned. These are lipid derivatives. So all steroid hormones are going to be derived from a lipid. Specifically, the lipid that they're derived from is cholesterol. Okay, so the steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. And these lipid hormones are going to share a similar structure. Now, only 4 structures in the human body are going to produce steroid hormones. So these might be a little bit easier to memorize first, and then just learn that the rest of them are the amino acid and protein ones. Okay, so the 4 structures that are able to produce the amino acid, the steroid hormones, include the adrenal glands, the gonads, testes and ovaries, so testes in males, ovaries in females, and the placenta as well. Okay, so the thing that makes these steroid hormones unique is that being derived from cholesterol, they're lipid soluble. Okay, remember, what is your cell membrane made out of? Phospholipids. Your cell membranes are made up of lipids. So if you're dealing with a lipid soluble hormone, that means that these lipid soluble hormones, okay, they're actually able to readily pass through cell membranes without needing receptor sites to let them in. Okay, or not to let them in, but rather I should say they don't need receptors in order to exert their effects. They're able to slip in to the inside of the cell, okay, because they're lipid soluble. Now, one thing, however, is that these steroid hormones, they're not able to travel in the blood without a helper. So these steroid hormones need to be bound to specific transport proteins in the blood. And then once they're bound to those specific transport proteins in the blood, they can then circulate in the blood where they reach their targets and they're able to diffuse across the membrane, okay, where they exert their effect within the cell versus the amino acid and proteins which need the receptor on the outside. Okay? Any questions so far? Yep.
What do you mean that the precursor molecule, is it, what do you mean it's inactive in the cell, and then when it binds and is activated by the hormone, then it starts cleaving the molecules and making.
In which case though, like the pro?
Amino acids, peptides, polypeptides, right?
The amino acid derivatives? So like the catecholamines, you mean, or the thyroid hormone?
I forget which one it was, but it was the one that came from precursor molecules that are cleaved.
Okay, so just again, no, you're good. So just to summarize, so just so that we're clear. So again, the easiest way to kind of classify these, because we're kind of like looking at three different groups, right? We said that there's the amino acid derivatives, we said that there's the protein ones, and then there's the steroid ones. So we can, like in the notes, it groups each one of these separately, but we can technically group the amino acids and the proteins together because essentially amino acids and proteins are made up of the same stuff. Amino acids are amino acids and proteins are made up of amino acids. So we can kind of put them together. So when we talk about specifically the ones that are just made up of amino acids, not the long chain proteins, but just amino acids, you have the thyroid, which is one category, the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. And then you have the catecholamines. Some examples of the catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And these types of hormones, the amino acid derivatives, these need a receptor on the surface of your cell in order to exert its effect. So that's when we were talking about the lock-in key mechanism. So when these hormones are released into the blood, they're going to travel in the circulatory system until they reach their target organs, or target tissues, I should say. And if those target tissues have receptors that are sensitive to this hormone, the two will bind together and you'll get some type of metabolic reaction inside the cell, which we'll talk about later in more detail. But the key thing here is that the site of action is occurring on the surface. Okay, that's where they have their effect, on the surface. When we talked about the peptide hormones or the protein hormones, we said that most of the hormones that we're going to learn about are actually a lot larger than the amino acid derivatives. Even though they're kind of the same, but these are a lot larger than the amino acid derivatives. They're made up of many, many amino acids hooked up together. So the peptide hormones, those are the most numerous. And one subtype of the peptide hormones are called prohormones. This is the example that we're giving us here. Okay, so one subtype. Some of these are not prohormones, but one subtype is going to be a prohormone. And these prohormones, these are able to be excreted in the body. They're circulating in your bloodstream. Okay, kind of like waiting to attack, right? So they're circulating in your bloodstream, but they have no effect. But once some other hormone or once some other chemical is released, that other chemical is going to bind to that one, which was already in the bloodstream, and it's going to cause that one to change and convert. And then now it's converted into the actual active form. Now, that was like a complex process. Amino acids are too simple for that. So the type of hormone that would fall under would be a peptide hormone. So peptide hormones sometimes are considered these prohormones that are inactive precursors to molecules that need to be converted into the active form. Okay. And then the last one that we talked about was the steroid hormones. And then the thing that we said was unique about the steroid hormones is that they don't care about receptors on the plasma membrane. Because they're lipid soluble, they're able to pass through the plasma membrane and exert their effect whatever they're going to do, they're able to slip through onto the inside of the cell. But in order to circulate in the blood, they need transport protein molecules. Okay. All right. And then this is a good table to study here. So this table goes over the different types of hormones that we just discussed. So the first one was the peptide hormone. That was the protein hormones. We said these are typically synthesized or sometimes synthesized as prohormones. They require further processing or cleavage to be activated. They're stored in vesicles, which, if you recall, those vesicles are small, like little membrane-bound sacs that contain chemicals. Most of these are going to be water soluble, so we consider peptide and amino acid hormones water soluble. These are going to bind to receptors on the cell membrane, and they're going to transduce some type of signal via what we'll call a secondary messenger system. We'll talk about that later. The effects are often fast, and then here are some examples. And then for the steroid hormones, we said that these come from cholesterol. Okay, these are typically released immediately. These are nonpolar. These are lipid soluble. These are going to pass through the plasma membrane, and they're going to bind to intracellular receptors in order to change gene expression directly. Okay, and these are some examples. So you can study that table, but there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to move on. I want to start talking about some of these actual hormones. So again, we're saying that hormones are going to be produced by different populations of cells throughout the body. Now, over time, through research, it's become more and more clear that many tissues that we traditionally would not have thought as endocrine organs are actually types of tissues that are going to secrete hormones as well. So maybe traditionally, when we think about these different endocrine glands, we think of things like the pineal gland. We think of things like the pancreas, the adrenal gland, the pituitary gland. So like these right here. This is usually what we think of when we think of the endocrine system, right? The pituitary gland, like I mentioned, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, the testes, the ovaries. But there are actually a lot of other tissues within the body that actually kind of work as glands as well. So like the heart, for example, produces hormones. The thymus itself produces hormones. The digestive tract, the kidneys, okay, all of these produce hormones as well. But what we're going to focus on are the more traditional types for the most part, okay? So again, some traditional endocrine organs include the pancreas, okay, and the pancreas is going to be this organ here. The pancreas is going to produce insulin and glucagon. Okay, we also have the hypothalamus up here. Okay, near the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. Okay, we also have the adrenal glands. These are the glands above the kidneys, sometimes called the suprarenal glands. And then of course, we have the thyroid gland. But again, just to remind everybody, we also have some surprising tissues that are going to work as glands as well, like adipose tissue, which produces leptin, and even the heart, like I mentioned, which produces certain hormones as well. Okay, what I'd like to discuss though next is how these different endocrine tissues are going to play a role in homeostasis within the body. Okay, so again, here are some examples of traditional glands that produce hormones, and then these are some other non-traditionals. Okay, let's move on here. So how do these hormones work? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how these hormones work. So we said that the way that these hormones work is that key and lock mechanism. Okay, so in order for a cell to respond to a hormone, we said that that particular cell needs to have a unique, specialized, special receptor site for that hormone that's circulating in the blood. Otherwise, if that cell does not have the receptor, that hormone cannot affect the cell, essentially. So every single cell in your body is going to have various receptors for many, many different types of hormones, not just to one specific hormone, but every cell is going to have many receptors that responds to many, many different hormones. And this is important because we know that over time, different body conditions need to be able to respond in order to return back into homeostasis. So that's why we need these cells of ours to have various different types of receptor sites in order to be able to respond to various different needs. Okay. Okay, so when we talk about how hormones are going to exert their effects, we can classify how hormones exert their effects based on where they exert their effects. Okay, that's another way we can classify it, based on where they exert their effects. And what I mean by that, okay, so we were just talking about the peptide hormones and the amino acid hormones, right? And we said that these types of hormones are considered water soluble. So they can't cross through the cell membrane. So this thing that you see here in green, this is a cell. And you see here in the middle, this is the nucleus. And you can see that you have these hormones, these amino acid and protein hormones, these water soluble hormones on the outside, and they can't get in unless you have a receptor. Rather, I shouldn't say that they can't get in. I don't want you to think of it like that. They can't exert their effect without a membrane receptor. Okay, so if our particular cell happens to have the right receptor, the right key, I'm sorry, the right lock, I should say, for the right key, that hormone will bind to the receptor and will have some type of an effect. Some type of chemical reaction occurs within the cell. So again, one way to classify these hormones is based on where they exert their effect. So the peptide and the amino acid hormones, we would classify them as cell surface receptor hormones. Cell surface receptor hormones, okay? Now, to be a little bit more specific, what would happen is that these hormones would bind to one of these membrane receptors, and that would cause some type of chemical reaction to occur inside the cell. Okay. Now, the end result of that chemical reaction would be the production of a secondary chemical. Okay, there would be a secondary chemical, and that secondary chemical is the thing that would cause the cell to change. Okay, so when we talk about these water-soluble hormones, these cell surface receptor hormones, we also say that they utilize secondary messengers. Okay, and we'll give some examples of secondary messengers a little bit later. When we talk about these steroid hormones, okay, these steroid hormones can be classified as cytoplasmic hormones, or we can also call them nuclear receptor hormones. Because we said these steroid hormones, they do not require membrane receptors. Rather, they're able to diffuse across the membrane, as you see here. Now, once they're inside the cytosol, now they're going to bind to specialized receptors that are located inside the cell. When they bind to those specialized receptors inside the cell, they're going to be they're going to move into the nucleus. And within the nucleus of the cell, okay, that hormone that entered the nucleus is going to cause mRNA to be transcribed. Okay, we're going to get mRNA. And remember, mRNA is basically a blueprint of how to make a particular protein. Okay, so when that hormone, it bypasses the membrane, it binds to intercytoplasmic receptors, and then it enters the nucleus. It then causes mRNA to be transcribed. mRNA, that blueprint, is going to exit the nucleus. It's then going to go to which organelle? The rough endoplasmic reticulum. It's going to go to those ribosomes, and we're going to start putting the protein together. It comes out at the other end, we get protein synthesis. Okay, so that's how these steroid hormones are going to exert their effect directly onto the nucleus via gene activation, as we said. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at our first major endocrine system. Very important one here. It's called the hypothalamus. Now, if you remember, we talked about the hypothalamus already. Okay, we said that the hypothalamus is located in the brain. Okay, now the hypothalamus is actually quite small. However, it's incredibly important. And hopefully you all remember it's located in a portion of the brainstem. Okay, now the hypothalamus is going to function as two functions. Okay, the hypothalamus has two functions. Okay, it's going to function as an endocrine organ itself, and it's also going to control the actions of the pituitary gland. Okay, so it acts as an endocrine organ on its own, and then it also controls the action of the pituitary gland. So because the hypothalamus has this intimate and close relationship between the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, we sometimes refer to them as the, I think I have it here somewhere. I don't have it here. It might be in the notes. I believe it's in this. But for this reason, we sometimes refer to the hypothalamic hypophyseal system, because the pituitary gland, another name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. Okay? If I find that word a little bit later, I'll point it out. Okay? So again, the hypothalamus, very, very important, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay? So this is the hypothalamus up here. Okay? It's not the best picture. I think I have another one here. So this picture should look familiar. Okay, this picture should look familiar. So when we were talking about the brainstem, this is a portion of the brainstem that I want to refer to, this area here. Okay, do you all remember what this is here? This eye-shaped thing. Okay, good. So it is the hypothalamus. It's particularly the pineal gland. Okay, this is the pineal gland. And then if we look at the tissue right below the pineal gland, this tissue here, that's the hypothalamus. Okay, that's what we're referring to. That's the hypothalamus. Okay, and then I keep talking about the pituitary gland. Okay, the hypophysis. This little thing down here is the pituitary gland. That's the hypophysis. So once again, I hope that you're able to see the close relationship that the two have with one another. Very, very close to one another. Okay? And I said that because of this close relationship, we sometimes refer to the whole system as the hypothalamic hypophyseal system. So again, this is an extremely important player in the endocrine system. So we're going to spend some time examining it. So we said that this system consists of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And we said that the hypothalamus is the tissue that we see up here. And the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis, is this tissue that we see down here. Okay? And you'll notice that the pituitary gland is actually divided into two lobes. We have a anterior lobe. So this would be anterior, this would be posterior. So you have an anterior lobe and you have a posterior lobe. And this pituitary gland is going to be connected to the hypothalamus via a stalk that we call the infundibulum. Okay, so again, the hypothalamic hypophyseal system is going to consist of the hypothalamus along with the pituitary gland that's connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. Okay, now we're also going to see all around this system here, we're going to see a system or a network of nerves and a network of very important blood vessels that we're going to call a blood portal system. Okay, and lastly, a very important to talk about here when we're talking about the pituitary gland is going to be housed within the cranium, as you can see here. Okay, this is the pituitary gland. It's housed in a particular bone. You all should know that one. Which bone is it housed in? The sphenoid bone. Very good. The sphenoid bone. Do you all remember the particular name of that area where the pituitary gland is? The sella turcica. The sella turcica. Good. Okay, so the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, as you can see here, this is from above. Okay, it's going to house the pituitary gland. Okay, it's going to house the hypophysis. Okay, and like I mentioned earlier, the pituitary gland is divided into an anterior and a posterior. Now, the anterior, okay, is sometimes referred to as the adenohypophysis. Okay, and the posterior is sometimes referred to as the neurohypophysis. The reason why they're named as such is that if we were to histologically take a slice of the tissue, we would notice that the anterior pituitary gland is made up mostly of glandular tissue. Okay, it's like a true gland here that we're talking about, while the posterior pituitary gland is mostly made up of nervous tissue, modified nervous tissue. So it's kind of like a fake gland. It's not like a true gland, in fact. Okay, and I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. You know, it is part of the glandular system. I don't want you to, like, you know, on an exam or something, but it's not a gland. But it's different in its morphology. Okay, it's different in its histology.
Okay, we call it the adeno, and
the anterior is the adenohypophysis. The posterior is the neurohypophysis. Basically, modified nervous tissue. So let's start by talking about the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay, so the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the neurohypophysis, it's only going to secrete two hormones. Very easy. Okay, you only need to worry about two hormones, memorize two hormones for the posterior pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. Okay, those two hormones are ADH and oxytocin. Oxytocin you already know. You should be good with that one more or less, right? We said oxytocin produced by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Oxytocin, where is its target tissue? It's the uterus. Target tissue would be the uterus. There's another target tissue for oxytocin. Okay. The other thing that oxytocin does, the other target tissue that it has, is mammary tissue. Okay, it's the breasts, and what it does is that it's going to promote the letdown of milk, not the production. Okay, it produces the letdown of milk. Okay. Okay, so that is oxytocin. And then ADH, that stands for antidiuretic hormone. Does anyone have any idea where ADH, the target tissue of that is? What? It's close, but not the pancreas. Antidiuretic hormone. Kidneys. Kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone, its target tissue is the kidneys. Okay? Now, this is kind of interesting if you look at this. Remember that we were saying that a cluster of neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system are called nuclei. And we can see that there are several nuclei that are located in the hypothalamus. Okay? Now, look at these neurons here. Look at where the cell bodies are. Okay, these are hypothalamic neurons. They're located in the hypothalamus. And then look at their axons. They travel down the infundibulum. Okay, and then they terminate in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So the structure that was actually producing those two hormones was not actually the posterior pituitary gland. The structure that was actually producing those two hormones were the hypothalamic neurons, the neurons in the hypothalamus. Those hormones that we just mentioned, ADH and oxytocin, those are released via the posterior pituitary gland, but they're not produced. They're in the posterior. They're actually produced in the hypothalamus. Okay, so hopefully that starts to bring the concept together and understanding why it's called the neurohypothesis. Okay, because it's mainly made up of nervous tissue that's going to release its chemicals, its hormones, directly into the bloodstream, because we're going to have these capillaries wrapping around the pituitary gland. Okay? Now, again, those capillaries that wrap around the pituitary gland, we're going to call that a portal circulatory system. And the body actually has several portal circulatory systems. And we'll be discussing several of those in our semester, but one of those exists here in the pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary gland, or the adenohypophysis, how does that work? Okay, now you can see here in the hypothalamus, we're going to get these glands, this cluster of tissue here, that's going to produce hormones. That's going to produce what we call regulatory hormones. It's a special type of hormone, okay, but they produce hormones, basically. And remember, all through here we have capillaries, okay? So when these cells produce their hormones, these regulatory hormones, they then travel via the blood to the anterior pituitary gland. And the glands that make up the anterior pituitary gland then get stimulated by those hormones. And in return, they then produce their own set of hormones. Those are secreted into the bloodstream, and then those have their target tissues. So again, the important thing to understand here is the hypothalamus is going to secrete regulatory hormones that only affect the anterior pituitary gland. It's not going to affect any other gland. It only affects the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, these we said are regulatory hormones. These are stimulating hormones. We'll talk about these more later. Once those are released, they're then going to promote the glandular tissue in the anterior pituitary gland to produce its own set of hormones that will then have its own specific target tissue, depending on what regulatory hormone was originally produced. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Okay? And then lastly, the way that the hypothalamus works is that there are actually fibers. As you can see here, there's actually nerve fibers that are connected from the hypothalamus directly into the adrenal glands. And these directly stimulate the adrenal glands to produce their hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. We'll talk about that later as well. Okay? So again, very important here, anterior pituitary gland, please don't forget, and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to secrete regulatory hormones that will control the anterior pituitary gland. Okay. And then we said also we have autonomic centers that directly stimulate the adrenal glands. Okay, and then we said also these are the two that the hypothalamus itself makes. Okay, and then the hypophyseal portal system that we were just talking about earlier. This is a capillary network and interconnected vessels between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Regulatory hormones are released from the hypothalamus at the median emesis of the infundibulum. They move from the interstitial fluid of the fenestrated capillaries, carried to the anterior. Okay, so you guys could read that, but this, I think I have a good picture here. This is what we mean. Okay, so in this case, this is the anterior, this is the posterior, right? So let's do the posterior first. You see the neurons that are located here? These neurons that are located here, we're going to call these the supraoptic nuclei. Okay, the supraoptic nuclei. Remember, a nuclei is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies. Okay, so the supraoptic nuclei. Okay, and then we also have another nuclei here called the paraventricular nuclei. So as you can see, the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei, those axons kind of converge here in the infundibulum, in the stalk area. And then they travel to the posterior pituitary gland, also called the neurohypophysis, where they're going to release their hormones directly into the hypophyseal portal system that we just talked about. And then those are released into the bloodstream, and then those go to their target tissue. What did we say were the two hormones that are produced here? ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Okay, those are the two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, but are released via the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin and ADH. And then the target tissue for oxytocin, we said that during childbirth, oxytocin will contract the uterus. Also plays a role in milk letdown during breastfeeding. And then antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, acts on the kidneys to regulate water balance. Okay, that's the posterior. Okay, what about the anterior pituitary gland? Okay, now look at the anterior pituitary gland. Here with the anterior pituitary gland, we have these nuclei, not really nuclei, these are just neurons that we're going to call neurosecretory neurons. And these neurosecretory neurons, as you can see here, also in the hypothalamus, they're going to release their neurotransmitters, their hormones rather, the pre-hormones, or the stimulating hormones, I should say, directly into this portal system. Okay, so they're going to release the stimulating hormones, or the releasing hormones, into this portal system. And then those releasing hormones will travel to the anterior pituitary gland, where we have several glands. And these glands are going to produce their own hormones in turn, which will then have their own target tissues. Okay? So again, the hypothalamus is going to release a substance called trophic factor, also otherwise known as releasing hormones. And these releasing hormones are going to be secreted into the portal system. They're going to travel to the anterior pituitary gland, to the adenohypophysis, and then they'll cause the anterior pituitary gland to do something, to function. So what are the different releasing hormones? Okay, what are the important releasing hormones? Okay, we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. Okay, let me see if I have a slide here. Okay, so this one I think kind of goes over it. Okay, so this might look really complex, but it's important to understand it. Very, very important. And this kind of summarizes a lot of what we're discussing, okay? So the hypothalamus is the massive tissue that we see up here, and then the hypophysis, also known as the pituitary gland, right? And we were just saying that we understand the posterior, I think. I would hope that everybody understands the posterior, the neurohypophysis. We said that the posterior is going to directly produce and release the hormones directly into the circulatory system via the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, and we said that we have antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And then we said that the anterior pituitary gland, the way that the anterior pituitary gland gets stimulated is also via the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus is going to produce regulatory hormones, which then travel to the portal system. They then bind to receptors on the glands here, which then in turn cause those glands to produce their own hormones. And then these are those releasing hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus that activate the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so let's talk about this. The first one that we have is thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so TRH is going to control the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and also the activity of the thyroid gland. So again, the hypothalamus is going to produce thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, and then the thyrotropin releasing hormone is essentially going to cause the anterior pituitary gland to produce hormones that are going to stimulate the thyroid gland. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone specifically. Okay, and that's what you kind of have to understand is that cascade. Okay, what about corticotropin releasing hormone or CRH? Okay, so corticotropin releasing hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, like we just mentioned. It's going to travel to the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to control the release of ACTH, okay? And then ACTH is going to travel into the blood. It's going to reach the adrenal glands, okay? And it's going to cause the adrenal glands to produce another hormone called the glucocorticoid hormones, okay? And those are steroid hormones. Okay, so, you know, this part down here, if you don't get it yet, that's fine. But I hope you understand this part with the posterior, and then this part here, and then how those affect the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so we also have growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. Okay, this is going to control the release of growth hormone from the adenohypophysis. Okay, we also have gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, this is going to regulate the release of gonadotropic hormones like LH and FSH from the adenohypophysis. And then these essentially will end up stimulating the gonads. Okay, so again, very important that you go through these and you feel comfortable with all of these names and where they're produced and then what they stimulate the production of. Okay? All right, so what about the anterior pituitary gland? Okay, what's going to be produced in the anterior pituitary gland? Well, we already kind of answered a few, right? We talked about ACTH. Okay, we talked about a few, but let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so one group of hormones that's produced by the anterior pituitary gland is going to be luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, LH and FSH. Okay, these are also known as the gonadotropins because these are going to affect the gonads. The gonads are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. Okay, so as you can see here, when the anterior pituitary gland produces follicle stimulating hormone will reach the testicles in males and cause the testicles in return to produce testosterone. Okay, same thing with luteinizing hormone. You need both of these to stimulate the testicles to produce those hormones. Okay, the ovaries, okay, when follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone reaches the ovaries, you would now get the female hormones. Okay, estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin as well. Okay, we also have thyroid stimulating hormone. We said thyroid stimulating hormone would essentially stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. Okay, ACTH, I think we also talked about this one. That stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then that would stimulate the release of the steroid hormones by the suprarenal gland. Okay, we also have the growth hormone, which is GH. Okay, growth hormone would go to the liver, and it would stimulate essentially the body to grow. Okay, the liver would produce other chemicals in turn and cause the body to grow. Okay, prolactin, another important hormone that's produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and then prolactin would stimulate mammary gland development and also milk production. Okay, so again, I think this slide here does a really good job of summarizing the hypophysis and the pituitary gland. Okay, so remember the hypophysis, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So remember the hypothalamus, okay, we have mainly two methods that it's going to work. Regulatory hormones and directly releasing those hormones. We said the posterior is going to directly release ADH and oxytocin. Okay, and we already said what these are going to have an effect on, right? The kidneys or uterine smooth muscle contraction and the mammary glands. Okay. Then when we talked about these, we said that these are the regulatory hormones that are also produced in the hypothalamus, but these are going to travel in the portal system to reach the anterior pituitary gland to cause the release of the respective hormones that are released in turn by the anterior pituitary. Okay. Any questions so far on this? I know it gets a little bit complex, but I think if you study it, it's pretty straightforward. And then again, if you go through the slides that we just talked about, we talked about the releasing hormones and the inhibiting hormones, okay, which are produced by the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, okay, the two lobes that it comprises, the sella turcica. These are the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland: TSH, ACTH, the gonadotropins, growth hormones, prolactin. This one, melanocyte stimulating hormone, is another one that we didn't talk too much about. And then, it goes into detail about each one of these hormones. So thyroid stimulating hormone, what does it do? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, what does it do? So be sure to study those. I'm going to kind of go past these for right now. Prolactin. We talked about antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Oxytocin we talked about. And then this one was that good one that we used to summarize everything up till now, right? Okay, any questions up to this point? Okay, so let's move on to the thyroid gland. Okay, so the thyroid gland is located on the anterior surface of the trachea. So the front surface of the trachea, right underneath the thyroid cartilage. So right underneath the Adam's apple, essentially. So it's going to be composed of two lobes that are connected by a narrow isthmus. And this is also going to have an extensive blood supply that gives us a red coloration. So this right here is the thyroid cartilage, which is going to form the Adam's apple. And then right below the Adam's apple, this mass of tissue that you have here, this is the thyroid gland. And once again, it's basically two lobes, a left and a right lobe, and then the isthmus that joins the two lobes together. Again, we're going to find a network of capillaries that's going to supply the thyroid gland. So, so the thyroid gland, again, is located right below the Adam's apple. And the thyroid gland is going to produce two important related hormones. Okay, the two hormones that the thyroid gland is going to produce are these two right here, T3 and T4. Okay, so T4 is also known as thyroxine. Okay, and T3 is known as triiodothyronine. Okay, so T3 and T4 are what the thyroid gland are going to produce. Okay, there's another hormone that's important that the thyroid gland is going to produce, and that one is known as calcitonin. I think I have it here somewhere. Maybe a little bit later in the slide, but since we're running out of time, I kind of want to just go through it. So the other one is calcitonin. And again, this is also covered. Oh, here we go. The other one is calcitonin. Okay, so those are the three important ones that the thyroid gland produces. T3, T4, and calcitonin. Okay, and calcitonin, that one you should also be familiar with because that one we talked about last semester that also plays a role in regulating calcium levels in blood. Okay, now the thyroid gland and the thyroid hormones are important for early development and early growth in infants and children. But these hormones are not considered essential for life. Okay, so for this reason, individuals that have thyroid hormone abnormalities, you might find that people who have thyroid problems, it's actually something quite common. Than other endocrine disorders because it's so compatible with life, if you will. Okay, now these thyroid hormones that we're talking about, they're going to be derived from iodine, essentially. So the main thing is that these hormones are going to have an iodide or an iodine molecule attached, which essentially is what makes them unique. Okay, so again, this is what the thyroid gland looks like from the front. Okay, so if we talk a little bit about the histology of the thyroid gland is going to consist of a number of large structures called thyroid follicles. These follicles are made up of large spheres that are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. In the middle of the follicle, we're going to have a fluid called colloid, and within that colloid is where we make the T3 and the T4. Okay, so into the colloid, the follicle cells are going to secrete a globular protein called thyroglobulin. And then this is essentially going to be converted into T3 and T4. Okay, we also have another type of cell called C cells or clear cells. And then these were the ones that are going to secrete calcitonin. We said that calcitonin helps to regulate calcium levels in the blood. So this is one of those thyroid follicles that I'm talking about. This is the layer of simple cuboidal that we're talking about. This is another follicle. This is like another follicle here. The colloid here in the middle, made up of thyroglobulin. And we said that that's going to play an important role in the production of T3 and T4. And this cell here that doesn't stain very well, that would be a C cell. And we said that that one's going to produce calcitonin. Okay, and then I think we're done at 6:45, right? Yeah, so we're out of time. Please read the rest of this section as homework. If I have time, I might put up a video recording, but otherwise, please wrap up on homework as far as this chapter is concerned, as well as reading the rest of the chapter in your book, just in case you need some further clarification, okay? Thank you.
Oh, that's the one. Right. Yes. Sometimes when I'm writing at the same time, I have to go back.